The gunner's log at Bovington, dated March 1959, records the Conqueror's 120mm L, one-gun firing, armor-piercing, discarding Sabre rounds through 390mm of rolled homogeneous armor at 1,000 yards. The projectile left a hole you could put a fist through. Colonel George MacDonnell of the Fighting Vehicles Research and Development Establishment at Chertsey signed off the trial with a single underlined phrase in his summary: "No comparable Soviet plate withstands penetration at combat range." That sentence, buried in WO194 files at Kew, is the beginning of an answer to a question that would preoccupy Warsaw Pact tank commanders for the next 15 years. The Conqueror had been born in an office off Whitehall in late 1946, when the Directorate of Royal Armoured Corps received the first intelligence assessments of the Soviet IS-3 heavy tank. The IS-3 had rolled through Berlin during the Allied Victory Parade of September 7th, 1945, and British observers, including Major General Sir Percy Hobart, had watched it in near silence. Its 122mm gun and sloped frontal armor represented a generational jump. Field Marshal Montgomery, then Chief of the Imperial General Staff, wrote to the War Office that the Centurion, only just entering service, could not be relied upon to defeat the IS-3 at fighting range. Something heavier was required. The specification issued by the FVRDE in April 1949 called for a tank capable of destroying any known or projected Soviet heavy armor at 2,000 yards. The gun came first. Vickers Armstrongs at Ellswick machined the L1 barrel to accept a 120mm round derived from the American T-43 program, sharing ammunition under a 1950 Anglo-American agreement signed at the Pentagon by Sir John Slessor. The chassis followed, drawn up by the Royal Ordnance Factory at Leeds. By the time the first prototype was rolled out in 1955, the vehicle weighed 64 tons, mounted a fire control turret independent of the main hull, and carried a Meteor engine producing 810 horsepower. The Conqueror entered service in 1956 with the Royal Tank Regiment and the 4th Royal Tank Regiment in West Germany, deployed forward with the British Army of the Rhine. 9 were assigned to each armoured regiment, one troop of 3 tanks per squadron, tasked with a single doctrinal role: overwatch. They would sit hull down on reverse slopes along the North German plain, engaging Soviet armour at ranges where the Centurions could not yet fire. The Fulda Gap, the Göttingen Corridor, the approaches to Hanover. These were the killing grounds mapped out by BAOR planners at Rheindahlen, and the Conqueror was the instrument of first resort. What the Soviets knew about the tank arrived through the usual channels: military attachés at Farnborough, defectors, and the occasional glimpse during exercises on Lüneburg Heath. GRU assessments held at Podolsk, since partially declassified, described the Conqueror in dry technical language. The 120mm APDS round was calculated to penetrate 390mm at 900 meters. The T-54, then the mainstay of the group of Soviet forces in Germany, carried 200mm of frontal armor. The arithmetic was simple, and it was not comforting. By 1961, the arithmetic had grown worse. The T-62 entered production at Nizhny Tagil that year, replacing the T-54 in first-line regiments. Its 115mm smoothbore U-5TS gun was a genuine advance, but its armor, 242mm at the glacis and 214mm on the turret front, remained inside the Conqueror's lethal envelope at any range up to 2,000 yards. Soviet commanders were instructed, in field manuals circulated through the Third Shock Army, that the Conqueror was not to be engaged frontally under any circumstances. The order was specific, and it was written down. The document that codified the Soviet posture was Field Manual 44-62, issued by the General Staff in Moscow in the summer of 1963, and distributed down to battalion level within the group of Soviet forces in Germany. A copy reached the Joint Intelligence Committee in London in February 1964, passed through a source run by the Secret Intelligence Service in Berlin, whose identity remains protected in the files. The manual devoted 3 paragraphs to the Conqueror. T-62 crews were to disengage on visual identification, seek defilade, and call for artillery or attack aircraft. Frontal engagement was prohibited. Flanking maneuvers were permitted only when the Conqueror's overwatch position had been confirmed as isolated from Centurion support. The JIC assessment, JIC 6418, marked secret UK eyes only, treated this development with cautious satisfaction. Sir Bernard Burroughs, then chairing the committee, noted in his covering letter to the Cabinet Office that the manual represented confirmation that our heavy armour has achieved the deterrent effect intended by the 1949 specification. The Foreign Office found the intelligence useful in a different way. Harold Wilson's government, taking office in October 1964, was already reviewing defence expenditure, and Dennis Healey at the Ministry of Defence needed arguments to justify the retention of British forces on the continent. The Conqueror's psychological weight became one of those arguments. The tank itself was, by 1964, approaching obsolescence. Only 185 vehicles had ever been built. The Meteor engine, a converted Merlin aero unit, was prone to overheating in prolonged exercises. Range on internal fuel was 95 miles. The fire control system, sophisticated for 1955, was being outstripped by developments elsewhere. The Chieftain program, running at Vickers and the Royal Ordnance Factory Leeds throughout the early 1960s, was intended to replace both the Centurion and the Conqueror in a single vehicle. Chieftain's 120mm L11 rifled gun, firing a new APDS round, would offer comparable penetration in a chassis weighing 55 tons rather than 64. Healey signed the withdrawal order in July 1966. The last Conquerors left BAOR in early 1967, most of them handed to gunnery ranges at Kirkcudbright and Lulworth as hard targets, a few preserved at Bovington. What did not leave, however, was the Soviet doctrinal instruction. Field Manual 44-62 remained in force. GRU analysts at Kudinka appear to have concluded that the Chieftain, when it entered service with the 11th Hussar in West Germany in April 1967, was simply the Conqueror's successor with equivalent capabilities. The prohibition on frontal engagement was extended to cover the new vehicle in a revised manual issued in October 1967. The order to avoid the Conqueror had, in effect, outlived the tank. This was the peculiar economy of Cold War deterrence. A vehicle that had never fired its main gun in anger, whose production run was smaller than a single Soviet tank regiment's establishment, had shaped the tactical doctrine of the largest armoured force in Europe. The credit belonged not to Vickers or to the Meteor engine, but to the intelligence loop that had informed the 1949 specification. The gunnery trials at Kirkcudbright that had proven the L1's performance, and the willingness of successive British governments, Attlee's, Churchill's, Eden's, Macmillan's, to fund a weapon system for a war they hoped never to fight. The T-62 crews of the 3rd Shock Army, garrisoned at Magdeburg and Halle, trained through the 1960s and into the 1970s on the assumption that certain British tanks were, in effect, uncontestable at range. Whether that assumption was accurate mattered less than the fact that it was operational. Deterrence, as the strategists at the Royal United Services Institute like to observe, is what the other side believes. The problem of British armour on the North German plain had begun long before the Conqueror. It had begun on July 26, 1945, when Clement Attlee walked into Downing Street with a Labour majority of 145 and inherited a British Army of the Rhine that consisted on paper of 21 divisions. Within 18 months that force had contracted to 4. Demobilisation was rapid, popular and financially unavoidable. Sterling was under pressure, rationing was tighter than it had been during the war, and the American loan negotiated by Keynes in December 1945 was already being drawn down. The Cabinet Defence Committee, chaired by Attlee himself, faced the arithmetic of an empire that could no longer afford its garrisons. Ernest Bevin at the Foreign Office understood the danger before most of his colleagues. Bevin's memoranda from early 1946, held in FO 371 at Kew, describe a Soviet Union that had not demobilized in the same proportion. The Red Army in Central Europe still fielded, by Bevin's estimate, 175 divisions in various states of readiness. Even discounted for post-war fatigue, the disparity was severe. Bevin's response, worked out with Sir Orme Sargent and Sir William Strang at the Foreign Office, was to seek a security architecture that would tie the United States to the defense of Western Europe. The Treaty of Brussels of March 1948 was the first step. The North Atlantic Treaty, signed in Washington on April 4, 1949, was the culmination. The armour question sat inside this larger diplomatic frame. British planners at the War Office knew that BAOR, whatever its treaty commitments, would fight outnumbered. The Chiefs of Staff paper COS 4877, circulated in June 1948, calculated that Soviet forces could reach the Rhine within 14 days of a general offensive. Nuclear weapons would compensate, but the Attlee government's atomic program, authorized in secret by General 163 in January 1947, would not produce a deliverable weapon until October 1952. In the interim, conventional forces had to hold the ground long enough for American strategic bombers to intervene. That required tanks that could kill Soviet tanks. The Centurion, first ordered in 1943 and rolling off the production lines at Vickers by 1946, was the immediate solution. Its 17-pounder gun, later upgraded to a 20-pounder and then to the 105mm L7, gave it competitive performance against the T-34/85 and, with the L7 fitted from 1959, against the T-54 and T-55. But the Centurion was a medium tank. The heavy problem, the IS-3 problem, required a heavy answer. Attlee's Defense Committee approved the FVRDE specification for a heavy gun tank in November 1949, 3 weeks after the North Atlantic Treaty came into force. The decision was defended in Cabinet by A.V. Alexander, the Minister of Defense, as insurance against a Soviet breakthrough. The cost, estimated at £15 million over 5 years for development and initial production, was substantial for a government that had just devalued sterling from $4.03 to $2.80 in September 1949. Attlee approved it anyway. The Berlin blockade, lifted only in May of that year, had concentrated mines in Downing Street. The design work moved to Chertsey under Major L.F. Gawler, who had led the Comet program during the war. Gawler's team drew heavily on the American T-43 project, which was developing a similar heavy tank around a 120mm gun. Anglo-American cooperation on armour, formalised at a series of meetings at Detroit and Farnborough between 1950 and 1952, allowed the L1 gun to share ammunition with the American M103. This was practical logistics, and it was also political theatre. The Conqueror, when it appeared, was a British tank built for a British doctrine, but it carried the imprint of the transatlantic alliance that Bevin had constructed. The gunnery trials at Kirkcudbright, conducted between September 1955 and March 1956, produced the numbers that would define the Conqueror's reputation. Firing L1 armour-piercing, discarding sabot rounds against sloped plate at 30 degrees, the gun achieved penetration of 400mm at 500 yards and 350mm at 1,500 yards. Against vertical plate, the figures were higher still. The Fighting Vehicles Research and Development Establishment Report, FVRDE2/56, concluded that the L1 was capable of defeating any Soviet armour then in service or projected within a 5-year horizon. The projection proved conservative. The T-10, the Soviet heavy tank that entered production at Chelyabinsk in 1953 and would remain in service into the 1980s, carried 250mm of frontal turret armour. The T-54 carried 200mm. The T-55, introduced in 1958, offered marginal improvements. When the T-62 arrived in 1961, its glacis of 242 mm at 60 degrees represented the ceiling of Soviet armor protection until the T-64 entered limited service in 1967. The L1 gun, throughout this period, retained the arithmetic advantage. What the trials could not measure was the tactical environment in which the Conqueror would fight. BAOR doctrine, refined through a series of exercises on Lüneburg Heath and the Soltau training area between 1957 and 1965, placed the heavy tank in a specific role. Exercises Spearhead in 1961 and Quick Train in 1963 rehearsed the same scenario: a Soviet armoured thrust across the inner German border, main effort along the Hanover axis, secondary effort towards Kassel. The 1st British Corps, headquartered at Bielefeld, would fight a delaying action from prepared positions along successive waterlines, the Weser, the Leine, and finally the Rhine itself. Conquerors would engage Soviet leading elements at maximum range from reverse slope positions, then withdraw to secondary positions before counter-battery fire could locate them. The doctrine was pessimistic. The BAOR staff estimated that a full-scale Soviet offensive would achieve local force ratios of 6-to-1 in armor and 4-to-1 in infantry. The purpose of the Conqueror was not to win the tank battle. It was to impose sufficient cost on the Soviet advance that political decisions could be taken in Washington and London before Warsaw Pact forces reached the Rhine. Every minute of delay, every T-62 or T-55 destroyed in the opening engagements, translated into political time. This was the argument that Field Marshal Sir Gerald Templer, Chief of the Imperial General Staff from 1955 to 1958, put to the Cabinet Defence Committee when the Conqueror's cost was questioned. Templer's Memorandum of March 1957 argued that heavy armour was a form of insurance whose value could not be calculated by counting vehicles. The Soviets, Templer wrote, would allocate resources to counter a British capability whether or not that capability was ever used. The Conqueror was tying down Soviet engineering effort at Chelyabinsk and Nizhny Tagil that might otherwise have gone into extending the T-62 or accelerating the T-64. The tank was fighting, in Templer's phrase, before it fires. Templer's argument was borne out by the design history of Soviet heavy armour after 1955. The T-10M, an upgraded variant of the T-10 introduced in 1957, carried a new 122mm M62T2 S-gun, specifically intended to engage Western heavy tanks at range. The specification for the T-64, drawn up at the Kharkiv Design Bureau in 1961 under Alexander Morozov, prioritized frontal armor improvements and a new 115mm smoothbore gun that would become the D-68. Both programs consumed engineering resources that Soviet planners would have preferred to invest elsewhere. The Conqueror, in this sense, was profitable long before it was ever fielded. By the time the tank left BAOR service in 1967, the tactical situation had shifted again. The Chieftain, entering service with the 11th Hussars at Detmold in April of that year, carried the L11 120mm rifled gun. Its APDS round, the L15, offered penetration figures comparable to the L1 in a lighter, faster vehicle. The Conqueror's doctrinal role passed to Chieftain without interruption, and the Soviet prohibition on frontal engagement transferred with it. The Chieftain's arrival changed the numbers, but not the underlying calculation. Where the Conqueror had committed 64 tons to the Overwatch role, the Chieftain concentrated similar firepower in 55 tons, and gave every squadron of every armoured regiment in BAOR access to the 120mm gun. By 1970, the 1st British Corps fielded some 900 chieftains across 4 armoured regiments and various supporting units. The doctrinal shift was substantial. The Overwatch function was no longer the responsibility of 9 tanks per regiment. It was the primary combat capability of every tank in the force. Soviet responses to the Chieftain, tracked through GCHQ intercepts of Warsaw Pact, exercise traffic at Cheltenham, and through JIC assessments circulated in the early 1970s, showed a similar pattern to the response to the Conqueror. Field manuals distributed within the group of Soviet forces in Germany identified the Chieftain as a priority target for tactical air power and long-range artillery. Su-24 Fencer strikes, once the aircraft entered service in 1974, were to be directed against Chieftain concentrations in the core rear area before contact was made. The MT-12 Rapira, 100mm anti-tank gun, distributed to Soviet motor rifle divisions from the late 1960s, was tasked in doctrine with engaging the Chieftain's flanks and rear from concealed positions. The Chieftain's own trials, conducted at Bovington and Kirkcudbright between 1966 and 1968, confirmed the L-11 gun's effectiveness. Against representative Soviet armor plate at 2,000 yards, the L-15 APDS round penetrated 300 millimeters of rolled homogeneous armor at 30 degrees. The T-64, when its armor scheme was finally assessed by British intelligence in 1972, carried composite protection equivalent to approximately 400 millimeters against kinetic energy penetrators on the glacis. The arithmetic had tightened, but the Chieftain remained inside the envelope at combat range. The vehicle had problems. The Leyland L60 engine, a multi-fuel opposed piston design intended to run on diesel, petrol or paraffin depending on operational availability, was chronically unreliable in early production. Regiments at Farling-Bostel and Paderborn reported serviceability rates below 50% during the winter of 1968-69. The problem became a political issue. Dennis Healey, still at the Ministry of Defence, was pressed in the Commons on November 12, 1968, to explain why a tank costing £90,000 per unit could not be relied upon to move under its own power. The engine was progressively modified through the L60 Mark 8A program, and by 1974 serviceability had reached acceptable levels. But the reputation lingered. What did not linger was any Soviet inclination to test the tank. The Chieftain never fired its gun in a European engagement. Its combat record, such as it was, belonged to the Iranian army, which had received 707 chieftains under the Shah between 1971 and 1979, and used them in the Iran-Iraq War from 1980 onwards. Reports reaching the Ministry of Defence through the Defence Intelligence Staff described mixed performance, but the tanks were operating in desert conditions against T-55s and T-62s crewed by Iraqis rather than Soviets. The European calculation remained theoretical and, in remaining theoretical, remained successful. The Berlin Infantry Brigade, garrisoned in the western sectors of the divided city under the command of Major General Sir Robert Corbett and his successors, maintained a small chieftain presence throughout the 1970s and 1980s as a symbol of British commitment. The tanks were operationally irrelevant. 2 squadrons of chieftains could not have held Berlin for a day against the forces available to the 20th Guards Army at Bernau. Their function was political, and it was understood as political. When Sir Frank Roberts, retired from the Foreign Office but still consulted by Whitehall on Soviet questions, was asked in 1976 what purpose the Berlin garrison served, he answered that its purpose was to be killed and thereby to guarantee an American response. It was not a comfortable formulation. The Chieftain-era ran through the 1970s and into the 1980s, overlapping with the arrival of its successor. The Challenger 1, entering service in 1983, carried Chobham composite armour that transformed the survivability calculation. By the time the Cold War ended, British armour had moved through 3 generations, and the doctrinal prohibition first written into Soviet manuals in 1963 had, in various forms, persisted. The intelligence loop that sustained the British armour calculation ran through several channels. GCHQ at Cheltenham, formally established under that name in 1946 from the Wartime Government Code, and Cipher School, provided the largest single stream. Warsaw Pact exercise traffic, gunnery school communications from Kazan and Ulyanovsk, and the routine administrative signals of Soviet armoured formations in East Germany all yielded fragmentary but cumulatively substantial information about equipment, training standards, and doctrinal evolution. The Composite Signals Organization stations at Chicksands, run jointly with the Americans, and at Gartow in West Berlin, contributed additional coverage. The Secret Intelligence Service ran human sources with access to Warsaw Pact military materials from the 1950s onwards. The most productive was Colonel Oleg Penkovsky of the GRU, run jointly with the CIA between April 1961 and his arrest in October 1962. Penkovsky provided several thousand pages of Soviet military documents, including sections of the field manuals that governed T-54 and early T-62 employment. His material informed the JIC's understanding of Soviet tactical doctrine at exactly the moment the Conqueror was reaching peak deployment. Sir Dick White at MI6 and later Sir John Rennie treated Penkovsky's product as foundational. The Defense Intelligence Staff, formed in 1964 by the amalgamation of the three service intelligence branches under the Ministry of Defense, provided the analytical layer. Its Directorate of Scientific and Technical Intelligence at Metropole Building in Northumberland Avenue produced the standard reference documents on Soviet armor, distributed under the DY-77 series. These assessments, updated annually, tracked every known variant of every Soviet tank, from the T-34/85 to the T-80. Copies went to the Chiefs of Staff Committee, to BAOR headquarters at Rheindahlen, and to the Royal Armoured Corps Gunnery School at Lulworth. The gunnery school itself was a node in the intelligence loop. Instructors at Lulworth, briefed with the latest DI-77 assessments, taught Centurion, Conqueror, and later Chieftain gunners to identify Soviet armor by silhouette, to estimate range against known Soviet vehicle dimensions, and to select the correct ammunition for each threat. A crew commander of a chieftain in the 4th Royal Tank Regiment in 1975 could in principle recite the frontal armor thickness of a T-62 to within 10 millimeters and select an appropriate aim point. Whether he would actually do so in the confusion of a real engagement was another question, but the training was there. The Joint Intelligence Committee, meeting weekly in the Cabinet Office under a chairman drawn from the Foreign Office, integrated the streams. Its current intelligence groups on the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe produced the assessments that reached ministers. The chairmanship of the JIC through the Cold War traced a Foreign Office lineage. Sir Bernard Burroughs, Sir Dennis Greenhill, Sir Stuart Crawford, Sir Anthony Duff. The assessments were sober, generally accurate within the limits of the available intelligence, and consistently emphasized the quantitative Soviet advantage and the qualitative Western response. The response required constant recalibration. When the T-64 was assessed to carry composite armor equivalent to 400 millimeters of steel, the Chieftain's L-15 round was no longer sufficient at all ranges. The Ministry of Defense commissioned the L-23 APFSDS round, entering service in 1983, which restored the penetration advantage. When the T-80 appeared carrying reactive armor blocks and a 125mm gun with an improved fire control system, the Challenger 1's L-26 charm, one round, developed at the Royal Ordnance Factory at Blackburn, was already in the pipeline. The competition was continuous and it was expensive. The cost was defended in Cabinet through a sequence of defense reviews. The 1957 Sandys White Paper had emphasized nuclear deterrence and cut conventional forces sharply. The 1966 Healy Review had accepted the withdrawal from east of Suez, but preserved BAOR. The 1975 Mason Review had further concentrated British effort on the Central Front in Europe. The 1981 Knott Review, driven by John Knott under Margaret Thatcher, had cut the Royal Navy but reaffirmed the commitment to armoured forces in West Germany. Each review preserved the tank programme because each review accepted the underlying JIC assessment. That Soviet forces in Central Europe outnumbered Western forces significantly, and that qualitative advantage in armour was one of the few compensations available. The Rhine Army at its peak in the mid-1980s comprised some 55,000 troops distributed across 4 armoured divisions and their supporting units. The 1st Armoured Division at Verdun, the 3rd at Soest, the 4th at Hereford, and the initial elements of the 2nd Infantry Division at York, with reinforcement responsibilities, together with the 1st Artillery Brigade and the Berlin garrison, represented the largest continuous British military commitment overseas in the Cold War. The bill ran in 1985 figures to approximately £1.5 billion annually. Roughly 60,000 dependents lived in British married quarters at Bielefeld, Paderborn, Osnabrück and the smaller garrison towns. The domestic politics of this commitment were less contentious than might have been expected. British public opinion, tested repeatedly by Maury and Gallup through the 1970s and 1980s, supported NATO membership and the German garrison by consistent majorities. The peace movement of the early 1980s, energized by the deployment of cruise missiles at Greenham Common from November 1983, focused overwhelmingly on nuclear weapons rather than conventional forces. The Chieftain and later the Challenger escaped the political controversy that attached to Polaris, Trident and Cruise. Margaret Thatcher, taking office in May 1979, treated the armoured commitment as fundamental. Her Defence Secretaries Francis Pym and then John Nott and then Michael Heseltine presided over the introduction of the Challenger 1, the modernisation of BAOR's infantry fighting vehicles from the FV-432 to the Warrior, and the sustained increase in defence spending to 5% of GDP that Thatcher had promised at the 1979 NATO summit. The tanks were part of a broader posture that included the Polaris successor decision of 1980 and the deployment of American ground-launched cruise missiles at Greenham Common and Molesworth. The Soviet perspective through the same period, reconstructed from documents released after 1991, showed continuing respect for British armoured capability. The General Staff Academy at Frunze, in its lectures on Western tank forces during the 1980s, presented the Chieftain and the Challenger as vehicles requiring specific tactical countermeasures. The doctrine of avoiding frontal engagement, first codified in 1963, was reaffirmed in successive editions of the manual through 1987. Soviet officers who defected westward, including Colonel Vladimir Rezun, who reached Britain in 1978 under the pseudonym Viktor Suvorov, confirmed the picture. Suvorov's account in his book Inside the Soviet Army, published in 1982, described the training of Soviet tank crews at Sverdlovsk and Kazan. British and American heavy tanks were presented as targets to be engaged only under favourable circumstances. Frontal duels at range were to be avoided. Ambush from concealed positions at short range, using the Soviet numerical advantage to overwhelm the Western firepower advantage, was the preferred approach. Suvorov's picture was consistent with the field manuals recovered through other intelligence channels, and it confirmed that the calculations set in motion by the Conqueror in 1956 had continued to shape Soviet thinking 3 decades later. The Rhine Army exercised this calculation regularly. Exercise Lionheart in September 1984, the largest British military exercise since the Second World War, deployed 130,000 troops across northern Germany in a simulated defence against a Warsaw Pact offensive. The exercise consumed £70 million and involved reinforcement units flown from the United Kingdom to prepared marshalling areas in the Netherlands and Belgium. Chieftains, and in limited numbers the early Challenger ones of the 4th/7th Royal Dragoon Guards, rehearsed the doctrine that had been developed for the Conqueror in 1956. The reverse slope positions were the same. The engagement ranges were the same. The killing grounds were the same. Sir Nigel Bagnall, Commander-in-Chief of BAOR from 1983 to 1985, and then Chief of the General Staff, spent his tenure reshaping the doctrine. Bagnall argued that the linear defence assumed in earlier planning would not survive contact with a determined Soviet offensive. His alternative developed with staff officers at Sennelager and codified in a series of BAOR directives from 1984, called for maneuver defense in depth. Reserves would counterattack Soviet penetrations rather than attempting to hold every kilometer of the inner German border. The heavy tank remained central to this concept, but its role shifted from static overwatch to mobile counterstroke. Challenger, with its superior mobility and Chobham armour, was better suited to Bagnall's doctrine than Chieftain had been. The doctrine was never tested in Europe. On November 9, 1989, the East German government announced that citizens could cross to the west. The Berlin Wall opened that night. Within 11 months, on October 3, 1990, Germany reunified. The group of Soviet forces in Germany, renamed the Western Group of Forces, began a phased withdrawal that would remove the last Russian units from German soil by August 31, 1994. The 3rd Shock Army at Magdeburg, the 8th Guards Army at Weimar, the 20th Guards Army at Eberswalde, all packed their equipment onto trains and departed eastwards. The British response was measured. Options for change, announced by Tom King in the Commons on July 25, 1990, reduced BAOR from 55,000 to 23,000 troops. 4 armoured divisions became 1. The tank fleet in Germany, having peaked at nearly 900 chieftains and challengers in the mid-1980s, was drawn down to a single armoured division based on Challenger 1. The Rhine Army as a distinct formation was reorganised into British Forces Germany, and then in successive reductions into the smaller garrison that persisted into the 21st century. The Challenger 1 finally saw combat, not against Soviet armour on the North German plain, but against Iraqi T-55s and T-72s in the Gulf War of February 1991. The 7th Armoured Brigade, the Desert Rats, deployed 176 Challengers to Saudi Arabia and fought through southern Iraq during Operation Granby. The tank performed better than its critics had predicted. Not a single Challenger was lost to enemy action. The L-23 APFSDS round destroyed Iraqi tanks at ranges up to 5,100 meters. The longest confirmed tank versus tank kill of the war. The doctrine developed for the Fulda Gap worked in the Iraqi desert with only limited modification. By the time the Gulf ceasefire was signed on February 28, 1991, the Soviet Union itself was in terminal difficulty. The August coup against Gorbachev failed in 3 days. Ukraine declared independence on August 24th. On December 25, 1991, Mikhail Gorbachev resigned as president of the Soviet Union, and the red flag came down over the Kremlin. The state that had produced the T-62 and the field manual instructing its crews to avoid the Conqueror ceased to exist. The Conquerors themselves had been scrapped for more than 2 decades. Of the 185 built, perhaps 20 survived in various states of preservation. The Tank Museum at Bovington retained several, including one restored to running condition. The vehicle at Kirkcudbright, used as a hard target through the 1970s, was recovered and displayed. A small number reached private collections. The rest went to the smelters at Sheffield and Cardiff. Their armour plate returned to the industrial process that had produced it. What remained was the record. The trials reports at Kew, the DI-77 assessments in the Ministry of Defence files, the JIC minutes in the Cabinet Office papers, the field manuals recovered from Warsaw Pact archives after 1991. Taken together, they document a specific claim that a tank of which fewer than 200 were ever built, which never fired its gun in combat, which was withdrawn from service after only 11 years, had shaped the tactical doctrine of the Soviet armoured forces in Central Europe for the duration of the Cold War. The claim is defensible on the evidence. Professor Sir Michael Howard, the historian of British strategy who had served as a Coldstream Guards officer in Italy in the Second World War, and who wrote extensively on the Cold War from Chitchell Professor's chair at Oxford, offered a characteristic assessment in a 1993 lecture at the Royal United Services Institute. Deterrence, Howard argued, is not measured by battles fought, but by battles avoided. The absence of a Soviet armoured offensive across the inner German border between 1949 and 1989 was, in Howard's phrase, the great non-event of the century. British armoured forces, from the Centurion through the Conqueror and the Chieftain to the Challenger, had contributed to that non-event. The Conqueror in particular had done so at a specific tactical level, by making a specific category of engagement uneconomic for the Warsaw Pact. That was Britain's finest hour on the North German plain, and it was fought and won without a shot.